Everyone, this is Lynette Elliott. We would like to thank you all for joining us for the Gravity Project Workgroup meeting. We will be discussing food insecurity data sets today. It's August 29th, and we really appreciate all of you joining us for this call with the upcoming holiday. So we appreciate you being here, and we will go through some administrative items first. Most of you have already seen this and heard this, but it's just friendly reminders. If you want to go to the next slide, please, Donna. You are all on mute on entry, so if you want to unmute yourself at any point to ask or answer questions or provide comments, you are more than welcome to do so when we open up the call for discussion. And we do record these calls and post them on the Confluence Wiki following each meeting, so you can access the meeting recordings there and the materials. If you would like to present questions or comments while the presentation is in motion, you can use your chat feature. If you hover your cursor down at the bottom of your screen, there's a little talk bubble down there. That's your chat feature. And if you send your chats to everyone, then not only can our team, but the rest of the group can also watch those and provide input. We've had some very lively discussions via chat the last few weeks, and we appreciate all your input. If you have any technical difficulties, you can email me. I am Lynette.Elliott, 2 L's and 2 T's, at emiadvisors.net. Next slide, please. If you have not already done so, and you've heard us say this many, many times, please do join the project. If you wish to be included on our email distribution list, you can join as a committed member or an other interested party, and we have levels of participation that run the gamut. We don't mind how much or how little or what you're tracking. We just want you to stay informed and be in the loop if you want to be so. And you can join the project on the Gravity Confluence. And you can find other information there as well. Next slide, please. We will go through some announcements, and then Linda Hyde is going to walk us through a review of the to-date data element submissions. We've had several come through in the past few days, and we really appreciate all of you taking the time to do that. And then Sarah DeSilvi will lead the discussion for interventions, roles, and the straw poll that we launched last week. And thank you for those of you who voted. We appreciate that too. And then we'll just go through some quick next steps at the end of the call. Next slide, please. You've seen this before if you joined us last time. We are officially an HL7 Fire Accelerator project now. So we have moved to our own space on the HL7 Confluence. So our Gravity Confluence homepage, the URL has changed for that, and we will include that updated URL in our follow-up emails. So you don't have to scribble it furiously while you see it on the screen here. We can also post it in the chat during the meeting if you want to copy paste it and have it for future reference. Next slide, please. We are also complete on our use case consensus voting. We really appreciate all of you who voted and all of you who provided so many really, really valuable comments. There were some things that were pointed out to us that had kind of, I guess, fallen through the cracks. So we've been making some updates to that document and are doing another internal review of it. So it's not going to be published immediately. We are targeting near the end of September to publish it. We're shooting for September 20th. It may be earlier than that, but we wanted to give ourselves enough time for the right people to read through it again. We had 61 use case consensus votes. We had 36 yes votes, 18 yes with comments votes, 7 abstains, and 0 formal objections. And we consider that a huge success. So thanks to all of you who voted and provided your input. Next slide, please. This is our schedule. You've seen this before if you've joined our calls before. We are here on 8/29, going through food insecurity data sets and value sets with the gaps. And tomorrow, August 30th, Friday, is the deadline for submitting food insecurity data elements. If you have had conversations with our internal team and they are working with you on that, you may have gotten an extension. If you need an extension, because we see some of you are working in the online tool but have not submitted your data elements yet, please email us. Just communicate with us. We can work with you. This is very important It's very important that we have input from all of you who want to provide it. So there's some wiggle room, not a lot, but contact us directly if you need a couple of more days or some help. Next slide, please. You'll note that we are still on a bi-weekly schedule, so our next meeting will be held September 9th, and we will keep working through food insecurity at that point and move through the rest of that domain before we kick off housing instability in October. Next slide, please. At this point, I'm going to hand over the call to Linda to review the data element submissions that we've received to date. Linda?
Thanks, Lynette. Next slide, please, Donna. All right, well, I'm going to update you on our status with our submissions to date from the last meeting. We actually received, as Lynette said, we received a couple more submissions since the last meeting as of the time that we put this slide deck together. So we were up to 13, but just a half hour ago, we got 2 more. So we're actually now at 15. And as Lynette said, if you're ready to submit, please, we want as many submissions as we can take in the time we have allotted. So just either submit by tomorrow or let us know if you need a couple of days extension, and we'll be happy to accommodate you. So we've made it through 6 submissions that have been fully reviewed. We have, as you can see here, our disposition has been updated in terms of the additions that we've had, or the number of duplicates, meaning those are entries that were already on our master list. So we just added your organization as another one who submitted that same data element. We had some more do not adds. Mostly these are out of scope, and we will have a rationale or a reason for why we mark them as do not adds on the file when we return it to you. And we still have waiting for information for 6 of the screening tools and questions. You can see we did, as of once we introduced our intervention framework 2 weeks ago, we have started to go through the interventions, and we've identified additions and duplicates, again, some do not add, some to park because they were appropriate for another one of our gravity domains, but not necessarily food insecurity. And we have a number that we need to get some additional information on. The reason we haven't returned more than we have now, we actually just returned 2 submissions back to the submitter with the results of our adjudication. But many of you have submitted interventions, and we wanted to wait until we had gone through the straw poll and reviewed the comments and if we were going to make any more changes to the interventions, we wanted to wait and then go back and make sure that we are reviewing your submissions with the most recent master intervention file. So this is where we stand to date. We will continue to update this and review this as we go through the review process. Next slide, Donna. Just a reminder that all of the additions and the duplicates that we have added since last week will be in the new master, which will be published tomorrow. And you can look for that sometime during the day tomorrow. We'll get that up there for you. Now I'm going to turn this over to Sarah, who will continue and bring you up to date on where we stand with our intervention discussion.
Hi, everyone. This is Sarah DeSilvi. You might remember we presented on the interventions at our last full gathering, and we felt the need to revisit some of the original content in lieu of the straw poll, just to kind of bring everyone to the same place, and then we can go forward from there. Next slide, Donna. So just to review, again, setting the stage, there's a structure and pattern of terminology that undergirds standard interventions in the clinical space, the things we normally do in clinical practice, like medications and immunizations, referrals to other providers and specialties. And what we know is that few of the interventions to address social determinants are going to fit within those existing terminologies. And so we have to build a framework of how we care for social needs in SNOMED in order to have consistency across settings. And consistently, I need to say very clearly, and this is part of what we heard back in the straw poll, our attempt to do this really tries to account for the many settings and roles across clinics and communities. We're not trying to be clinic-centric here. We understand that much of the work happens in community-based organizations. Next slide, Donna. So most of these activities interventions are going to be within the procedures domain of SNOMED. SNOMED defines procedures, again, as activities performed in the provision of health care. They say that this includes not only invasive procedures, but also administration of medicines, imaging, education, therapies, etc. And just a little summary is essentially procedures are all the concrete activities we employ, and I say we here to really try to broaden out the language wherever we are, clinic or non-clinic, to address patient concerns. Next slide. We just want to say we were led to this structure by the questions the structure to come by the questions we asked ourselves as we were reviewing submissions. And here are some submissions submitted by both the SMEs and members of the community, and they raised important questions for care, data tracking, and research. And you can see the underlined is basically summarized in the following statement. What are the actions being done to address social determinants of health? Like, what are the activities? We have provision, assessment, evaluated, educated, provided. Next. Another question that was raised about how specific we should be in our intervention documentation. For example, do we need to say home delivered meals as a parent code for Meals on Wheels? Do we need specific interventions for the WIC program, etc.? Next. Another question we asked ourselves is whether we should cluster interventions or whether interventions really need to be specified particularly in order to convey meaning. So when we put all this together, reviewing what was submitted by both ourselves and the community, the grand question was, considering all the actions and programs to address social determinants, what is the structure that's going to support us in our care and data tracking and research across all of our settings? Next slide, Donna. So this is the intervention framework. We're calling it Intervention Framework Part 1 because it definitely got revised in the course of reviewing from the straw poll. We'll get into that later. So you can see the major activities that we have on here are referral, provision, counseling, education, assess or assessment, evaluation, assistance, and then we had case management and care management. These activities were taken both from just the clinical concepts and from existing SNOMED terminology. The definitions were gleaned sometimes from HL7 definitions and sometimes from SNOMED definitions. And then the parenthetical spots really are places to insert any of the particulars, right? The parenthetical spaces exist because we really hope to build strings of information that are intelligible semantically. So we refer to X, and you can put different things in there. You can refer to WIC, you can refer to a case manager with the provision of X, so provision of food prescriptions, et cetera, et cetera. The next slide, please. I'm segueing into roles because we were talking about referrals, and we really feel like it's important to address this because this came up in the straw poll again. Addressing the social determinants really, and again, I cannot stress this enough, takes the shape of the community of concern. Activities can occur everywhere, in clinics, agencies, and community settings by everyone from licensed healthcare providers to willing community members. Our information exchange of roles needs to encompass this breadth in order to be representative and interoperable. And we stated very clearly that these activities will sometimes originate in the community space and return to the clinic. We're not just thinking about things that start in the clinic and move outward. The exhibiting provider taxonomy code set includes the normative business roles in healthcare settings with definitions. The many community roles and emerging healthcare roles are not yet in this taxonomy. We have to set some boundaries for ourselves because this is such an immense project that we have gotten into. So The project has definitely revealed a need for development of the definitions and the roles within that taxonomy, but we really cannot feasibly undertake that in this phase one of the Gravity project. So we're stressing again that the building of the specific roles that are not contained in the healthcare provider taxonomy code set and their definitions would be possibly for a phase two. However, we are building the terminology and do support the terminology for referrals to those individuals within SNOMED. Next slide, please. Can you hear me now? Can you hear me? I'm sorry, I'm in rural Vermont. You can hear me, but you can hear me now?
Yes.
Okay, sorry. Do I need to back up? Okay, or are you okay? So I think we're all together again. So again, this is in reference to the straw poll. Programs also have a role in providing interventions, of course. So the subject matter experts, that meaning us and our internal crew, have determined that terminology that denotes referrals to these programs and agencies are within scope and should be included. Therefore, the intervention framework supports that referrals need to be can be for individual clinicians and providers and programs, and we're seeing this in submissions within the community. Next slide, please. So that's basically a review of what we know so far with some clarifications. I'm now going to go into the straw poll and some of the decisions we've had to make in the wake of it. And okay, so next slide, please. So we had yes votes and 15 votes no and need to add intervention activities. Many of these no need to add intervention activities were actually questions about refining, which are totally understandable given that we made this massive attempt to try to create structure. So I'm going to review some of the comments we had within the no's and then address those concepts in turn. Some of the ones that are starred at the end, we haven't quite identified an approach to yet, so we'll get to them soon. There's been a lot of thinking as we've reviewed and received all these comments. So one of the first comments was to define case management and care management. Then we had another question about how is the activity of involving or reaching out to family or supportive individuals captured. We have another question about the role of community partners. We had multiple comments regarding how to document care planning and self-management within this structure. We had a comment about the lack of clarity differentiating counseling and education. We also had another comment about lack of clarity between evaluation of eligibility and assistance with. And then we had a comment that really focuses on needing to find a way to capture outcomes, including enrollment, utilization, et cetera. Most of these comments actually focus on trying to make this list as lean as possible so that we're not creating confusion as we attempt to go forward with our terminology build. Next slide, please. So I want to summarize briefly the way we answered question number 1. We did a lot of research and updated definitions for case management, care management, and care coordination are going to hopefully soon be on the glossary. But when we were looking at all this information, what really became clear is the activities that each of these different roles do, whether they be a case manager, or a care manager, or a care coordinator. Many of those activities as defined by agencies like ARC were actually in our structure, but we were missing a pretty big one. So this is the definition of the roles of case manager and care coordinator, which are definitely aligned with case management and care coordination from the healthcare provider taxonomy code set and CMS. And you can see that the action of coordinate is missing in our current structure. So we wonder basically as if we were looking down the wrong way, and what we needed to add was not the overarching term, case and care management, but the activity instead. So you can go to the next slide, please. Our recommendation at this time, again, is not to add specific approaches as interventions, approaches meaning case management, or care coordination, but to really flesh out the activities they all share in common for the greatest utility. So we're recommending removing case management and care management based on the concerns within the straw poll and adding an intervention of coordination built off the ARC definition. Again, this intervention is an activity shared by multiple disciplines, I just typo there, including RN, case management, care management, and social work. And there's existing terminology, the coordination of care plan, which is a SNOMED CT term. Next slide, please. So then you can see the interventions framework part 2 would be as follows. So we would have, again, referral, provision, counseling, education, assessment, evaluation of eligibility, assistance, and coordination. Next slide, please. This is addressing question number 4, and our question, and we've been working on this with some of the straw poll submitters, is whether care planning can really be a framework for missing interventions. We got a lot of comments and really thoughtful emails about how we were capturing involvement of family members, how we were capturing assessment of patient goals, how we were capturing engagement, and we basically just sat and thought for a while and thought about how really many of these activities happen within care planning. So we're exploring how well the intervention structure meets the breadth of the care planning process to enable communication and documentation regardless of role. So for example, education as a part of care planning would be education skills, nutrition, or nutrition conditions. And again, with that education could happen with any member of the care team as the person when someone thoughtfully wrote about how we would document education of family members. We're proposing adding assessment of patient goals, which would be new, assessment of barriers, which would be new. We're proposing refining an existing code that we had evaluation of progress towards goals to be something that's pretty complex because we know we can't represent these massive social needs that involve a lot of coordination and interventions to address them without talking about this and figuring out a structure, but it's very complex, and so we're very grateful for that. We're still researching and seeking insight on the best, really commonly understood and again commonly defined term to represent the mutuality of care planning, so we're not thinking in hierarchical structures of like from the provider to the patient in terms of collaboration or engagement, and we look forward for your feedback on that. Next slide. Oh. Can you hear me? Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Okay. Thank you. I'm sorry. Rural Vermont's playing hazards on me each day. So we had a question, and question number 5 was on the difference between counsel and education. So we had a really, again, a very thoughtful question referencing the structure and definitions. We recognized a need to clarify when counseling is appropriate rather than education. And they are definitely distinct terms. We're going to refresh here that counseling involves interviewing and applying mental health and behavioral strategies. We really recognize that it's not necessarily a universally appropriate intervention across all of our concepts. So we're reviewing the terms and concepts where this counseling activity would apply rather than just educating on a program. So examples that are really trying to clip and refine so that things are as clear as possible would be a general code could be counseling to overcome barriers to receiving assistance, because as a clinician in northern Vermont and outside of St. Albans near Burlington, I can see there's some chat questions there. I think helping Vermonters through the pride, overcoming their pride in order to accept SNAP is a regular occurrence. It happens like 35% of eligible elder population in Vermont that are eligible for SNAP actually get it. So that's a lot of what I do. Then on this is you could be counseling on specifically on programs' ability to enhance adherence to religious and/or medical dietary requirements, et cetera. So understanding that if you just universally apply counseling to all of our concepts, it might muddy the distinction between counseling and education, but recognizing that they are very different functions and that counseling is appropriate in the space, we're thinking about how to best build terminology to represent that. And then I think that is our presentation for now. Any questions? Oh, and because I can answer Monica's question, I think the definitions are not the problem, it's the application of them. So not all of the, for instance, if we think about the semantic logic we're building in the master list where you have the program of SNAP, right? We can't just take out education and insert counseling interchangeably without representing in the terminology we build the difference, because that's how we create meaning.
Can you hear me? Just thanks. I was just saying that we do distinguish in SNOMED between education and counselling. So we have different terms in different places. So just to let you know that, if that was helpful.
Thank you. Yeah, it is very helpful. And I think we definitely recognize and are grateful for that. And I think it's more so that we're trying to build it in ways that support the user to continue that difference in their documentation. Because somebody raised a question very thoughtfully about whether the end user will understand the difference when they employ them, and whether we should just create one term. And that wouldn't allow us actually the breadth of what I feel like we need to say. So maybe instead we actually need to clarify a little bit more what counseling in these instances would look like and what and why it's about. Thank you. I see a question number 4. Can you please summarize your takeaways from question number 4 again? Should I go back?
Yeah, I think it would be great if you could just recap that. It was one of the areas where your voice was cutting out the most. Okay,
so we can go backward. Yeah, so, and again, this is a very humble stab that we all took together, but we received many questions regarding patient engagement and goal assessment, and whether we needed an intervention code to represent those concepts. And so before we thought of adding something new, we wanted to see how well the current structure could represent the activities of care planning and patient engagement as it stood. And so we didn't have yet in our master list some of the activities of care planning if we built them off of the current structure. So what we did in this instance in this slide is just kind of did a rough draft of what it would look like if we conceptualized the activities of care planning built on what we're proposing, with the addition of a coordination code. But we recognize that that attempt still has limits in representing the mutuality bidirectional nature of care planning. So we just are admitting that it's like we still are trying to figure that part out. So this is that last bit. We got suggestions about collaboration or engagement, because we do not we want to try as much as possible to not lean on hierarchical language when in the care planning process in order to be person-centered. We're just doing our best there with limits because it's difficult. Was that helpful? And then I see a question from Greg Bloom. Should I try to answer that one?
Hi there, can you hear me?
Yeah.
So thanks for working through all this stuff. I feel your pain around the struggle of the size. My concern is I've been working on standards in the realm of health and human services, like in terms of what services exist. And I learned pretty early on that there's a difference between challenges of syntactic interoperability, which is just like, is data structured in a way that can be shared across multiple systems and read, coherently, which is different from, does the content of what's in the data mean the same thing to everybody? And so I guess there's an assumption here that the issues of syntactic interoperability, of just like, can this information actually be shared just in terms of regardless of the content, can the data be shared across systems and viewed in a coherent way? I guess there's an assumption that that's being addressed somewhere else, and that this is just focusing on the meaning of words that describe people's needs and words that describe different activities. Is that right?
I guess I wouldn't say it that way. I mean, I think what you're seeing now is a need. I mean, again, humbly, I'm trying to answer this. So deeply concerned about syntactic interoperability, and for a large part of the master, that's all we do. Like, what is, like, it's just about making things shareable and functional and using, standards that everyone can, like, from download and digest. But as SMEs, this is this is a lot of what we talk about in our mini groups, is this intersection of terminology wizards and subject matter wizards, is that we cannot forget the semantic consistency as we do consider the syntactic interoperability. So we're trying to do both at the same time, which is why this is so hard.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, just one thought. In my experience from my reading on the subject, it seems like semantic interoperability is like a kind of wicked problem, in that it might not be something that's solvable. It might be something that we can cope with more effectively or less effectively. But getting people to use the same words to mean the same things is, that's a problem that's as old as civilization. And oftentimes it's like, there are social solutions to it sometimes, institutional solutions, but it's oftentimes not, it's an elusive technical problem, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I think the idea is we certainly, language is amorphous, and as a diagnostician, I certainly know that even when you have a diagnostic criteria, people don't always use it, right? And so therefore you have inconsistency. I think we're hoping just to try our hardest to do our best, and then guided by all the intelligence of the folks who are making sure we're staying on the syntactic ground too. Again, imperfectly.
Sure.
Sarah, Scott Brown is asking if he can ask about how the end users or recipients' goals, preferences, and priorities will get incorporated into the interventions framework. And that it's a question if you'd like me to try and take a first stab at it, and while you think about what would you like? Okay, so to Scott, I think that the cornerstones of activities that have been established for looking at the three different domains that we're focusing on right now for SDOH give us a framework of connecting together the notion of these concerns with goals that are established to address concerns and interventions that are performed to advance or make progress against the goals. And so the notion of the goals is we haven't really got into this more specifically, but there is a notion of patient goals versus provider goals, and obviously we'd love to see that those goals are aligned. And there is syntax and there's work that's being done within FHIR and CDA on that already. But the idea is that the relationship between interventions and goals is that the interventions that are undertaken should align with and help make progress towards those goals. I don't hear any sound anymore. Anybody else hearing anything?
I can hear.
Okay.
Yeah, I guess we're having system-wide things that are not just me. That actually kind of makes me feel better.
I can hear you very well.
Okay. I saw a question from Maria Moen. Should we try to respond to that?
It says the clinical definition of care planning is a tree view type array where a problem or situation leads is closely followed by goals and then followed by intervention. So that's reinforcing kind of how I answered Scott's question. I know this is a different application of the term, but we should be careful not to bend the term too far for this utilization. I'm not sure I see that here. It could be my oversight, though. Maria, can you clarify? Are you seeing that we are following this framework, or are you trying to say that you don't see that we are following this tree? You called it a type of array. I hope Maria is still with us.
Everyone, this is Scott. Is everyone able to hear me now?
Yeah, we can hear you, Scott.
Great, because I went on like a 5-minute monologue, and that was all my best material. I think I was still on mute.
No.
No, I'm just kidding. So, no, the reason I raised the question earlier is not to call anybody out, but obviously I know Lisa's on the call. I think I saw Terry O'Malley, and so there were a bunch of folks on this call that were also involved in the work that Lisa and I did on personal advanced care plans. And in that, we were able to make some great progress on getting those end-user, patient-centered goals and preferences and priorities into the clinical record to support clinical decision-making around whether it's emergency care or advanced illness care or end-of-life care. And, one of the things that seems to be missing, and Lisa, I did say, even though I was on mute, that I understand your explanation and I get it. We just want to make sure that as we're looking at person-centered care, because we are talking about even people out in the community that are receiving these services, and not necessarily just patients, but that we are keeping them at the center. And there is that risk of when we're talking about goals, missing the point as to whether those are provider goals versus the recipient, end user, patient, person, whatever you want to call them, their goals. And their priorities for their care. We have it in the inpatient setting when we talk about people that need, high glucose or low glucose or gluten-free or a certain religious, kosher, things like that. We have that, and if we don't follow those sorts of things in the social determinants of health area outside of the clinical setting, we risk missing the target. So we just want to, I just want to be a part of that and make sure that we can help based on the work that we've done previously on personal advanced care planning, that we can do that the same thing here, and happy to support.
Awesome. Thanks for speaking up, Scott. And we're definitely trying to make use. I think we've talked a little bit about Gravity Project becoming a part of the FHIR Accelerator program, and that we are looking at shifting into a phase where the vocabulary and the concepts that are being developed by the Gravity community right now will shift into being used within some of these standard structures that exist already. And as you point out, Scott, the idea that structures exist for expressing patient goals and preferences and priorities. And preferences do tie sort of the notion of interventions and what I would prefer to have happen or what I would prefer not to have happen. So a lot of thinking has gone into that already. And the words and the concepts that Sarah and Donna are helping us to flesh out of the community and that Linda is chronicling into the master sheet there will be the concepts that we can use in those structures, those semantic structures that have been developed already.
And I do want to stress that we are humble about this work. We're also referencing all of the lovely work that's been done before us. So it's hard to represent that here on a Thursday afternoon, but definitely referencing the lovely Lloyd panels about assessing patient goals that we know are out there. And we had a conversation just Wednesday about, initially ties into the things that we haven't had time yet to build an approach to, but assessing goals well is not that different than trying to assess outcomes well and trying to understand how, in some sense, the limitations of our initial charter for this project hem us in a bit from really exploring those things as much as we want to. But we might actually just raise questions about things that we are not yet able to solve well, but we need to solve, we know we need to try to figure out in the future.
Great, thank you all.
Can I ask a question of, so in this attempt, this is actually directly to you, Scott, so we attempted to insert that assessment of patient goals into a structure I have right here on the slide. Is there a thought about how we could do that better to make sure that it's clearly person-centered as opposed to provider-centric?
Sarah, there's interesting work that's gone on ahead of us around describing goals that are as a way of a structural way of describing a goal and indicating if it is the patient's goal or if it is the provider's goal or if it is a shared goal. And the ideas of this have been documented in something that the HL7 Patient Care Workgroup documented in a domain analysis model that they created around care planning. And then there are examples of using those concepts both in the way that the goal resource has been invented in FHIR and also some of the templates that have been invented in CDA. They have also taken this notion where there's a way, like you can actually define, if the author of the goal is the patient, it means it's a patient goal. If the author of the goal is the provider, it's a provider goal. And if both are listed as authors, then it means this is a shared goal. But the expression of what the goal is the goal is the goal is the goal. It's a structural way of just saying this is the goal. So the patterns exist already.
Yes, yeah. I just wanted to make sure that if there was something that we could address in this initial approach that would better meet that amazing previous work, we would love to know. So if there's anything that we could do better right now in this presentation, that'd be great.
I think a lot of what happens is that we forget to ask. It's really a workflow kind of thing, that the mindset, think about the last time that you went to a doctor where your doctor actually said, so what are your goals? And then wrote that down. It's more of getting into the habit of thinking about it. So I think when we make patient stories that demonstrate these questions being asked and the answers being documented as part of the clinical record, I think that's where we really start to show a change in thinking about patient goals.
Absolutely. I mean, this is, so I humbly said.
Can I introduce a thought
please.
here?
I'm really not sure whether it's going to be relevant, but looking at these bullet points about education, assessment, and coordination, it does occur to me that all of this needs to be culturally appropriate for any given person. And I'm wondering, in our ultimate presentation of a framework for missing interventions, if we couldn't have a bullet point up top that says that everything, all the activities we talk about that we hope will eventually be coded and understood across institutional and professional boundaries, not to mention paid for by somebody, that we recognize that all of this needs to be culturally appropriate. Is that appropriate to, is that appropriate to be talking about with respect to a framework for missing interventions, or do we just assume that everybody knows that?
I think I would say always appropriate.
You're breaking up. Very eager to hear your answer. Not hearing you.
Can you hear me now?
Yes, thank you.
Can you hear me now? I just simply say it always has to be appropriate to state that as a process. I mean, Michael, someone just commented in the chat that it has to be intrinsic to the process. And I mean, I don't want to spend the whole time, like, there's many times that Donna and the A&D has that approach as well from the Academy's perspective. So I feel like
you feel what? I'm sorry.
If we're missing a way to take that very clearly in our current, if there's a working concept in the master, then we would love to work with you. But I think if we've been assuming that was intrinsic to the process, but it needs to be said certainly.
Okay.
This Tina Papasakis, if I could add just one little point here, since you mentioned the Academy and the NCPT, Sarah, the NCPT is developed with international input, and hope that cultural competency is part of that international contribution in the logic and the way the terms are developed.
Thank you, Tina.
Sarah, there's a question in the chat from Michael Peterson about the distinction being offered between a barrier like can't afford healthy food versus a behavior of unhealthy eating, where the patient has a choice but chooses not to change a behavior. Is there a distinction between behaviors versus habits or addiction when it vis-a-vis progress towards goals?
First of all, Michael Peterson is commenting that was Matt Bishop. I
got the wrong line. Sorry about that.
No, that's okay. And then Michael Peterson also has a question. And Donna, if you want to chime in here at any time, please do. But the question, I'm going to start with a question from Matt Bishop. So I think the thing is, because we are bound by the conceptual domain of food insecurity, the role of behavior in the individual is not the same as, it's a little bit narrowed, right? Because by definition, we're speaking about individuals that cannot afford food of sufficient quality, variety, or quantity. So again, we really have opened up this massive cauldron of, and again, built on the existing work that happened way before us. This whole children of concepts regarding the difference between assessing barriers and behaviors in care planning. And luckily we're not alone in that work. That work will happen long after we're done. But in this instance, we are kind of alleviated from having to address that because we're bound by the definition of food insecurity. And then coming after us, again, we're still talking about concepts with housing instability and homelessness and inadequate housing that are not as behavior driven. And again, that's not to give myself a buy. I wouldn't mind giving myself a buy every once in a while, but I hope that's a sufficient answer.
So, Sarah, this is Lisa. I'm really curious about this because the can't afford it issue comes up quite often. Are we drawing a distinction between, I'll just use a phrase, I don't know if this is right or not, but financial instability or financial insecurity versus food insecurity?
Well, we've been doing a review of, again, this goes back kind of to the idea of semantic consistency, right? So by having folks who are steeped in help with all this, financial strain is a different concept than food insecurity. So we've been careful not to conflate those two terms. So we really have tried to stay within the literature of food insecurity, specifically, which is the limited economic resource effect on food access or food ability to purchase food of sufficient quality, variety, and quantity. I hope that answers your question. Can't afford healthy food would be conceptually in line with food insecurity, though.
I have one other question. I don't know if anybody can hear me if I've unmuted myself. This is Serafina Versace. It's my first time joining this call, but thank you very much. I've been tracking your project, and it's very interesting. But in terms of food insecurity, one thing is not being able to afford it, but what about the availability of good sources of food within a reasonable distance of someone's living? Is that part of this concept? So, in other words, in neighborhoods where there isn't sources of available good food, you only find convenience stores with junk food. You don't find grocery stores that actually have fresh food and that. So my question is that part of this concept of food insecurity, lack of availability?
Lack of availability, definition, access, and we have, the USDA does have a definition of food access concerns. And again, I'm sorry, I hope this isn't going too far. I mean, there are situations where food access can create a situation of food insecurity,
right,
simply because let's imagine a situation where someone is surrounded by high costs for food in their meal, right? So that could be a conflation of those two terms, but those two terms would coexist. So you would have food access concerns and you would be food insecure. However, you can have food access concerns and not be food insecure. So we are trying to keep those things clear. And then Michael Peterson has yes. So this again, we know from the literature. So he's saying food insecurity leads to poor food choices as a result of access by zip code and food deserts. So this is that conflation that I'm speaking of. So if you do not live in an area where you have access to quality food at a reasonable cost, then you have food access issues and you have food insecurity at the same time. However, they're not always present and co-occurring. Michael, do you want us to go back and answer your question from above? You had a question regarding the screener, I believe, the person screening. Is this up at 4:45? Can you guys hear me?
Yes, we can.
Okay. Okay, he's saying no need to answer, so. Any other questions? Such a quiet, so quiet group. Can I ask a question about, just a general question of the group, whether everyone is having an easy enough time accessing the master as it's built and released? So we talk about concepts often here on Thursday because we need your input as we try to figure out the structure of the master list. But that master list is published on the Friday, and that represents the work as it stands. Are folks reviewing that as it's published?
I will just say, can you hear me? This is Lucy. I will just say that I sent an email days and days ago indicating a barrier to commenting on the master, and I never got a reply. So I sent that email earlier in this meeting to repeat the problem. So I don't know if I'm the only one, but I couldn't deal with the master as presented. So since you asked the question, that's my own personal response to the master.
We would love to make reviewing that master as easy as possible. So I'm sorry that we didn't get back to you in your email, but if you can write us again and clarify what your concerns are, that'd be really helpful because that represents the collective work.
Yeah, all right.
Donna, it's about time at the top of the hour. Would it be possible to advance to the next slide?
Yeah.
And we just need to remind everyone about submitting your data elements, and we do have a deadline Friday, August 30th, which we have come upon tomorrow. You can submit your data elements by email using the spreadsheet that's been provided or use the online tool. And if you've got hardship with meeting this deadline, please do send an email to the, you'll have to help me. Do we have an email on the next slide? Is there one? If you click one more, there you go. Send an email to gravityproject@emiadvisors.net, and we'll help you out with that.
Lisa, that's where I sent my original email on 8/15. And it does describe what the problem is. So I've resent that if somebody could have a look at it. Thank you. Okay.
Will do, Lucy. Thank you very much. We'll get on it. Yep. All right. Thank you, everyone. Have a great Labor Day weekend. And thank you to our presenters today as well. Sarah, we appreciate you calling in from northern Vermont.
Sorry for the sound quality.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, bye.